Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our final webinar of 2025. We will begin in just a moment. While everybody joins us, please take a moment to look at our 2025 sponsors. The Grow Native program will be nothing without them, and we encourage everybody to visit grownative.org to see all of the products and services that they offer. We are also doing our renewal for 2026. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Grow Native for Stormwater Management Practices. This is the final webinar of our 2025 series, which has spanned 24 meetings convened around an array of different topics on native flora and fauna, prairie projects, and the passionate people who do work so we can learn. Today, we're joined by Chuck Caverly for a webinar focused on the topic of cover crops for establishing native stormwater management projects. Under Chuck's direction, we will learn how and when to integrate a multiple species cover crop mix on project sites. And we'll consider how cover crops can be used to solve functional problems in green infrastructure projects. But before we continue, there are a few basics to cover. My name is Amanda Lance-Ramrup, and I am the Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and our 25-year-old Grow Native program. This webinar begins with a presentation from Chuck, followed by a Q&A session facilitated by Lily Germeroff, MPF's Conservation Program Associate. Throughout the next hour, we invite listeners to please type your questions for Chuck into the Q&A section on your screen, which you will find on the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. We will wrap everything up near the top of the hour. A little bit more now about Chuck. Chuck Caverly is a founding principal and botanist for the Missouri Native Stewardship Services organization. He earned his BS in botany from Truman State University and brings 40 years of experience in the green industry, including landscape design, native seed mix design, and stewardship service plans to his presentation today. Chuck is an ISA certified arborist with a TRAQ qualifications, as well as Grow Native certified, as well as being a Grow Native certified professional. He is a part of the Grow Native Committee and a past president and board member of the Municipal League of Metropolitan St. Louis and Missouri Municipal League. All right, we are ready to turn things over to you, Chuck.
Okay, well, good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So, okay, you ready for me to share?
Yes, go right on ahead. Thank you.
Okay, well, we will get started here. Just confirm, Amanda, we're good? Okay.
Looks great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, for logging in, and thank you, Grow Native and Amanda, for all your hard work and the opportunity to share some experience with everybody about using cover crops to aid in the establishment of natives, specifically for stormwater management practices. So that'll be our topic du jour. Let's see, make sure everything's working here. So our learning objectives today are pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but we're going to work hard to identify the stormwater sites and their issues, kind of a little bit of a review on what you might typically run into, why cover crops and what are they, when and how to integrate multiple species blends of cover crops, and then how you can use cover crops to solve and restore basins with cover crops. So might be a little bit humorous at times. If I'm a little too funny, then I'm sorry. My sense of humor is a little plant-centric. But I would start with this statement. If we always do what we have always done, we will always get what we have always gotten. And so what do I mean by that? For 40 years, I've been looking at sets of plans that include every time that there's a seeded area, especially a native seeded area, the specifier always seems to put down something like annual rye, or maybe winter wheat, or maybe spring oats, a single species of plants or a plant that's used and seeded over the top of the bare areas on a site. And so those natives, those annual single monocultures never have worked well for me. No matter how much seed I put down per acre, no matter how much effort I do to rake the seed in and pray for the water just the right way, no matter how thick the erosion control blanket is, it always seems like that plant mix that comes up or that single species that comes up is thin. So when you add that into a stormwater job that requires native plantings, and so they're big native seeded areas. The problem is the job site superintendent or the developer always asks for us to seed in June or August or April or November. And like most of you know, the ideal time to seed natives is when it's cold out, January, December, January or February, where we could have 30 days of meaningful cold weather that drops below temperature. The seed gets moist, we break the seed coat, and it works. So, how do you seed native seeds successfully in the middle of the summer to please the job site uh, management? And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So, first of all, a little bit of review. This is a classic metropolitan St. Louis sewer district cross section of what a typical stormwater BMP or water quality basin looks like. And I'll bring to your attention a couple of things. First off, if you see right here, it talks about 30 inches of thick bioretention soil medium. That soil medium, by definition, is typically a minimum of 60% sand, 20% compost, and 20% soil. So that's a pretty good mix. If you think about it, it's pretty light, should filter very well, and that's what its intent is. Those 30 inches sit on top of 6 inches of sand, then 6 inches of 3/8 inch clean gravel, and then 6 inches of 3/4 inch gravel. And note that it says gravel, it does not say limestone, right? So gravel is something that we steal from the creek. Limestone is something that we quarry from the ground. So that basin over time, 30 inches with another 18 inches, is 48 inches deep. So as you look at those layers, that drainage period is typically designed for after a rain event, that water that's held in this upper section of the basin typically takes 48 hours or maybe 72 hours before it percolates down. And it kind of makes sense, right? If the purpose of a stormwater basin, especially in an urban area like St. Louis or Kansas City, Columbia, Springfield, wherever it might be, uh, if we're trying to slow the impulse of a flash flood, storing that water on site for 24 hours makes a lot of sense. One thing to think about, though, is you see this under drain right here, which is typically 4, maybe 6 inches in diameter, depending on the specifier. That 4 inch pipe goes underneath the basin, and then at some point it elbows up 18 inches and then goes to an outflow structure, typically a concrete stormwater basin. And so what that means is that bottom 18 inches of the basin holds water over time. So even though we lose the water out of the top and it infiltrates through the soil and down into the lower rock layers, often that basin is holding water, especially in Missouri where you're in a real high clay environment. That clay base that's beneath it looks more like a coffee cup or acts more like a coffee cup than it does some type of methodology for infiltration. So what's left in the basin is potentially 18 inches of water. So it makes sense, right, that we would put native plants in that basin because they're going to put their roots down 6 to 8 feet in depth on average. So those native plants, even though we haven't had water for a while, those native plants will go down and they'll pull the water out of those 18 inches in on the bottom of the basin. Kind of clever, right? So why do basins fail? How do we get here? So in this example that you see here, this is a classic little curb inlet off a parking lot. You see there's failure along the side of the riprap. There's often fabric that gets placed beneath the riprap. And so the water will curl down off the concrete edge, run beneath the fabric, beneath the riprap. And then everything that you see here, this light gray, is silt. And so that silt could be debris from the parking lot. Most likely, it is soil that washes out from underneath the filter fabric or underneath or along the edges where it erodes. So if we were to think about what this design should look like, that riprap layer should come to the top of the curb, because in this scenario, there's no forebay. Forebay meaning an area that treats the water, it slows the water down to get the material to drop out of it, like the sediment to drop out of it. So you would collect the sediment up here on the parking lot. But in this case, it just blows right through, comes over the top or goes along the side and creates this issue of silt in the basin. So some of those classic causes could be poor design. I'll never say that in front of an engineer without making him raise his hand first as an engineer. Could be poor installation, poor maintenance. Overall, it's probably the lack of stewardship, lack of understanding of all the pieces in the mix that impact the basin. The second piece are those causal agents of failure, typically are silt, could be neglect, could be salt, because I've never met a landscape contractor that doesn't know how to throw a lot of salt in the wintertime. And so that landscape contractor also may be coming in here to try to figure out how to maintain this slope. And because you can't put a walk behind or a riding lawnmower up over the curb very easily, and you're not pulling that machine through the basin, so this area gets line trimmed. And when it gets line trimmed from April until the end of October, that grass is maybe a half-inch tall. It dies out during the summertime. God forbid there's a weed that gets sprayed in there, because if there's weeds, the lawn care operator comes in and kills out all the broadleaf weeds, and naturally the overspray kills out all the plants, like you see here, which should be in the basin. They've all been killed by the herbicide use. So the question is, how do you solve this? Now you have this basin that looks like this that's not functioning. In other words, that water sits in that basin for 72 hours or more, may take 2 or 3 weeks. You may have a water line that's 8 inches or 12 inches high around the edges, where that water has now killed all the sod. And so it's just this endless cycle of more and more sediment going into those basins. So, how do we solve the issue? One way is to remove all of that, to take all of that out. The other way is to establish the infiltration using cover crops, and that's what we're going to get to. So native plants, it makes sense that we use them. And often we see them in the forebay. So right here where my arrow is, this is an inlet structure coming off neighborhood streets in a subdivision. This is part of common ground in a new subdivision. And so this area right here is the forebay, the pre-treatment area. So a lot of times we see that specified as seeded with native seed. Then that water checks through a rock weir, which is right in through here, into the water quality basin, which is this section right here. So this is the section that would be 48 inches deep. And then that water goes underground, and in this case comes all the way back over to the structure in the back left corner over here. And all of this green area that you see back here would be compensatory storage. So it might be storage in case of a huge event that slows it down. It could be water on site that isn't required to be treated, that might migrate through from another site. Hard to tell, but often when the design is, you'll see more than one of these structures. And then all of this was supposed to be native around the perimeter of the site. So from the top of that berm that you see, all the way down into the basin. So from the top of the berm, all of these internal berms, all of that is supposed to be natives. Clever idea, right? Native plants, 6 to 8 feet deep root systems, which allow infiltration of that water over time. So you see those in the forebay. Rarely do we see those being plugged. More often than not, that's just seeded. The stormwater basins, the water quality cell, it's often plugged, but then everything else is almost always seeded. and it's always specified being used with an erosion control blanket like an S75 or an SC150, which helps hold the seed in place as it gets established. So, what are cover crops? Why would we look at cover crops? So, most often the context for cover crops comes from the agricultural world. And so, as you all know, as we learn about plants and we look at different industries that use plants, the key is to leverage the information that we learn in one area and try to figure out how to apply it into the area or the issue that we're having. So, for me, looking at cover crops, specifically a mix of cover crops, was really the first step in understanding why my annual rye never did very well. And part of that's because I was counting on one species to do the work. So cover crops have long been used as either a nurse crop or a companion crop. They're used a lot in regenerative agriculture. They're used a lot in the soil health movement, and they're planted often with a very specific purpose in mind. For example, clovers and peas do a really great job at fixing nitrogen, right? So, clover and peas that are in the ground for 90 to 120 days may fix on the upwards of 120 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So, if I was a farmer and knowing that my corn crop needed 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre to make the crop, then the cover crop could do that naturally. And as Gabe Brown, if you know who he is, says, why would you go and buy fertilizer when there's 14,000 pounds of atmospheric nitrogen above every acre of ground? Why wouldn't we just pull it from the air? So cover crops make a lot of sense in agriculture. So the idea of the cover crop or the nurse crop purpose is the common practice of using short-term or annual species of plants to protect or nurse a companion species in early establishment. These plants are typically short-lived or terminated during the season. Terminated might be by a non-selective herbicide. They might be terminated by a selective herbicide. They may be mowed or cultivated, mowed super short, or in some cases, if you have a short cover crop and your desirable species, for example, corn, which gets 4 to 6 foot tall or taller, will shade out whatever that initial cover crop was that you planted. So there's lots of ways to terminate it, but and in some cases they may stay and grow consistently throughout the season beneath that big plant. So from a traditional construction standpoint in stormwater applications, often these new seeded areas are treated with both a permanent seed mix, as we talked about, as well as a short-term, quick-to-germinate species to serve as that transition to permanent cover, i.e. annual rye. So annual rye, for example, if we were to seed annual rye, the classic is 2 bushels per acre, which is about 112 pounds of, of annual rye per acre, which translates to about 38 seeds per square foot. Spring oats and winter wheat aren't too different from that, but annual rye is the one that I have seen the most. It has quick germination time, especially with water, 7 to 10 days. It's typically only an annual, and although it may go to seed, typically the long-term impact of it reseeding is not a problem. And often it's combined with a short-term erosion control blanket. So a short-term erosion control blanket, S75, or a straw, which is a straw blanket with a plastic netting, or a 150, sometimes a 250 or a 350, which refer to the length of the cover that those blankets provide. If you're doing a traditional, I should say, the classic stormwater basin or site that's being developed, when you're using an S75 because they're the most economical, chances are you're going to get 90, maybe 110 days of protection from that erosion control blanket before it falls apart. The S150, you might get 180 days. So if you think about that for a minute, if we put down, let's just say June 1st, we have a project to do and we seed our permanent native cover or native seed mix along with a short-term cover, and we cover it with an erosion control blanket. that native perennial mix, for the most part, the majority of those species aren't going to germinate until the following April. So if I have a blanket that lasts 75 or 90 or 150 days, it doesn't get me what I need to as far as protection or armament to the following year. So that's kind of a challenge. Often the agency expectations when we get done with a project, like this one that's been restored, blankets have been put down. The agency will come in and say, for example, the Metropolitan Sewer District, or if you have a SWIP requirement that you're working with, often that requires 30 days of green growing cover. So not that you got the area to turn green, but that it's been green for 30 days. So sometimes you're 45 days or longer down the road before you can really figure out that you're not at 80%. That might be a water issue. This past spring, for example, we had a great wet spring in the St. Louis area, mid-Missouri area. As the summer wore on, we didn't get any rain from July 15th through most of the fall. And so if you were seeding those areas and counting on moisture to help out with the process, it didn't happen very well. So that your expectation, my point in this is saying your most of your agencies have a pretty high expectation for green, and that's important because they're not going to sign off on the success of the project until they see green, which means you're not going to get paid for 65, 70, 90, 120, 180 days until they're satisfied. So when we talk about singular species of cover crops, we talk about grasses, for example, like wheat and rye and barley and oats. They typically will germinate in 7 to 14 days. They typically will put their roots down 30 inches deep into the soil. And then to terminate them, you're either going to mow them or spray. And then, so as you look down my list, clovers, same thing, 7 to 21 days worth of germination, 30-inch depth in roots. Beans and peas are 7 to 21 days, 20 to 30 inches in depth, and either their life cycle or the frost will terminate them. Brassicas, things like daikon radish or purple top turnip, will germinate pretty quickly, 7 to 15 days, 12 to 36 inches in root. And remember, things like a daikon radish may put down a root 28 inches deep, and it might be 2 to 3 inches in depth, or 2 to 3 inches in diameter. I'm sorry. And then two other examples are buckwheat and sunflower. The buckwheat has a little shallower root, although it's really super fibrous. And then the sunflower, of course, the Paradovic sunflower can hit 30 inches. So when you look at the advantages of each plant, you're like, well, why wouldn't I use more than one, right? Why would you put all of your eggs in one basket? And can you mix these? Well, in the regenerative ag world and in agriculture, often multi-species mixes or polymerous cover crop mixes are used all the time. Because if you're looking to rebuild things in the soil, for example, nitrogen, or if you're looking for a plant that will find and scavenge potassium or phosphorus from the soil, things like the brassicas do that very well. The buckwheat will do that pretty darn well. The grasses do that. And so now you've got plants that are either fixing nitrogen or collecting phosphorus and potassium. So it's quick and easy and available. And they do all that within 90 to 120 days. So now you're making the difference to the soil. And if you think about it, most of these construction sites that we work on are so disturbed. The amount of organic material left in the soil, the amount of organic life in the soil has long been compacted, turned over, flipped upside down. The old worry that every builder comes in and scavenges the topsoil and then sells it, and then what you get left is nothing but rock and clay. If you're in an ag situation, for example, a lot of those farm fields that have been farmed for generations, There's so much compaction in that mix, and there's so little organic soil left in that mix that it's hard for the plants to grow effectively without some type of supplemental nutrition like nitrogen or any of those fertilizers. So when you're looking at creating your cover crop mix, and there's no wrong to this mix. You're looking at your germination time, you're looking at your root depth, and you're also looking at ease of termination. So as you put all that together, uh, the combination of a 2 species, a 3 species, a 9 species. Some of the literature that I've read have species mix on the order of 12 or 15 different species. The other thing to think about is cool season and warm season plants. So knowing that things are going to germinate when those temperatures are lower at 45 degrees perhaps, or the warm season, which they're going to grow at higher temperatures. Things like sun hemp, which gets crazy tall, or cowpeas, they do great in the heat of the summertime with no water. It all depends on what you're looking for out of your mix. So if you remember, or if we talk about why are those 30 inches of depth important, cover crops can develop a root system within 190 to 120 days that is going to be 30 inches in depth on average. Now, remember our little cross section here of the classic basin. 30 inches is the standard for the soil medium. And when these basins fail, they fail because either the mulch layer is contaminated or the pea gravel layer across the top is contaminated. It's been silted in. And so the desire and the plant material, the native plant material that was originally put in the ground is gone. So now the goal is to go in and reestablish that infiltration. So if you think about it, perennial plants put their roots down every year, right? And sometimes one or two of those roots may die. Well, nobody comes behind them and fills in those little dead root zones. Those little dead root zones become capillary bypasses or macropores in the soil. If you think about a turnip or a radish, that's a macropore. That takes a lot of water, will help move through that basin. And remember, the water quality component of this is geared toward that water getting filtrated out by the soil. So if we can't get the water into that soil mix, we can't filtrate it. To come into a basin that's failing and dig all of that material out, and maybe the material in the bottom, the sand and the pea gravel and the 3/4 inch gravel in the base, is really, really expensive. So other things to think about, some additional benefits of a mixed species cover crop mix. First of all, it's building the soil biology. Remember that construction site, there's not much left here. And even though in the water quality basin, you may be adding 20% compost and 20% good topsoil into that mix with the 60% sand, that's pretty good stuff, right? That's pretty good planting material. But the basin edges, the walls, the forebay, the retention or detention floors, that's just all clay and rock, right? It's poor soil. And so if you're gonna tell me that I've got to put down my native seed in June, and you're gonna tell me that I have until next April to improve the soil, why wouldn't I improve the soil with cover crops, right? Why wouldn't I take that time, those 9 months, those 6 months, those 3 months, whatever it might be? Why wouldn't I take that time to improve the soil? Stormwater infiltration is the second one. Remember, 90 days. Those grasses, a lot of those plants are going to kick in 30 inches of infiltration channels, right? 30 inches of roots. So when you kill or you terminate that plant, all of that root mass is left in place and it all becomes those infiltration channels. The other thing to think about is armoring the soil. Remember earlier I talked about storm or erosion control basins that are used in stormwater basins, depending on what the model of that basin is, or the model of what that erosion control basin is, meaning an S75 or an SC 150 or whatever it might be. Some of those, they just don't last that long. So in this case, remember our June 1st example. The June 1st example, our cover crops come in, that mix starts growing, does its thing, grows for 6 months until it gets burned up by a frost in mid to late November, the way it happens around here anymore. But it could be even late October. And all of that mass, which may be 24 to 30 inches in height, moving forward, all gets laid down, right? And then as the winter comes in and snow and rain, all of that lays down and covers the soil. So it covers the soil and it provides armament from the erosion control component. And then lastly, the pollinator habitat that's created. If we're doing natives, we're going to attract native species of bees and pollinator butterflies and moths, whatever it takes, right? So that's just what happens with natives. When we use the cover crop mix, like buckwheat, for example, buckwheat goes to flower very, very quickly, and the bees respond right away. Even the Paradovic sunflower flowers in the summertime. That's pretty clever. The clovers, as they bloom, all of those are really helpful for the pollinator habitat. So not only are we armoring the soil, we're creating infiltration systems, we're even helping with the pollinators. So how do these all shape up? So how do we create this seed mix? Remember when we talked about the annual rye at 112 pounds. Annual rye kicks somewhere at 38 seeds per square foot when you're all done with it at 112 pounds per acre. So the cover crop mix that I like to use has 10 species. And here are the 10 species that we use all the time: buckwheat, hybrid or Paradovic sunflower, purple top turnip, pearl top millet, spring oats, barley, winter Austrian peas, then the fixation Balanza clover and the Berseem clover. And if you look at those seed counts, those are the number of seeds per pound. And then the percentage of the mix is what it is on the right. The percentage can be all what you want it to be. There's no rhyme or reason. I'm just sharing with you what works for me. So when I put all this together, and we typically either have 1,000 pounds or 2,000 pounds mixed at a time, we end up with something silly like 2.1 million seeds per acre. And how do I get to 2.1 million seeds? Well, I take 40 pounds of my seed mix, and that's my application rate. That gives me about 48 or 49 seeds per square foot compared to the annual rye, which is only 38 seeds per square foot. So you can tell some of these, like sunflower seeds, are big, right? Only 4,000 seeds per pound. That's why the birds like the sunflowers that are easy to see. On the other side of that, clover, which only represents 1% of the mix, is only one 50,000 seeds, or I'm sorry, 500,000 seeds or 200,000 seeds per pound. That's a lot of little bitty grains of salt if you think about it. So as we mix all that together, our seeding rate is 40 pounds per acre, which is about 48 seeds per square foot. Germination rate is typically 7 to 21 days, and not all of these plants germinate at the same time. And I would tell you, after using these for 5 or 6 years, these different mixes, multi-species mixes, not everything germinates at the same time. Often I'll see an early spring germination, then I might see a later summer germination. Some plants take a little more time to get going. So also, if you notice, that mix is a mix of cool season and warm season species. So some things need that higher soil temperature. Remember, native perennials in most warm season plants like that soil temperature of 56 degrees or above, where the cool season can germinate down into the 40s. They're also, this mix is in general mostly high moisture tolerant. In other words, once it gets going, it can take a rain event for 48 hours without killing the mix. The other thing that happens is some of those plants do better with that high moisture content, like the Berseem clover, for example, really likes that extra moisture. So consequently, you get great success. Also, let's see. So number 5 would be the high salinity tolerance. So there, some of these species can really tolerate a lot of salt in the soil mix. Why is that important? Well, we typically don't put soil salt in our soil mixes, but typically what we find is salt from the parking lot ends up in our basins that we're trying to grow natives in. The photo on the right is buckwheat up close. And so there's not only flower structure here, but you see there's some seeds in here that have already started. So that little guy peaks out about 15, 18, maybe 24 inches tall and flowers pretty darn quickly. So some additional advantage, like we talked about already, season-long soil armament. We're protecting the soil over the long haul. In the seed mix that I showed you, there are 5 different plant species in that mix. So we know just like the diversity of the native plants bring in a broader diversity of native pollinators, we also know that the diversity of native plant or the diversity of plant families that are growing in the soil create an environment within the biology of the soil that bring in different types of bacterium, right? Different types of microorganisms. And it's those very microorganisms that are lacking in the soil from as a result of construction that we need to rebuild in that soil profile to make even our natives successful. So building of that soil biology is a big plus. Most of these native plants will benefit. So if they will benefit from improved soil fertility, why wouldn't we do that? And how do we do it? We do it with a cover crop mix that's capable of collecting phosphorus and potassium, as well as fixing nitrogen. The mix hits its maturity in 90 to 120 days. So you've got a stormwater basin that's holding water, and come 15th of March, you can get on it. I would throw this seed down at 40 pounds per acre into that basin. I would let it go 120 days. I would mow it, terminate it, and put it down again. And so you'll get 240 days worth of growth. And then in late August, early September, go ahead and replant that basin with the natives as per the original specification. And remember, at termination is when the creation of all the infiltration channels and macropores really become developed because all of those living roots from your cover crop mix have now been terminated. So they die and they leave those bypasses in the soil. So you're trying to say to yourself, where would I use cover crops? What are the applications? And my easy answer to that is everywhere. New construction sites, stormwater basins and forebays, restoration of BMPs or restoration of stormwater quality cells, aiding in the establishment of perennial cover. So if you've got slopes, you've got big forebays, you've got big natural areas, they work great. Cover crop mix is also what we use. This multi-species cover crop mix is what we use on utility scale solar sites because they peak out at 28 to 36 inches in height. So they're below the panel height, the bottom or the lower edge of the solar collector. So they work fantastic there and they help armor that soil, help suppress the agricultural weeds that are already there. They do a fantastic job on utility scale solar sites. Municipal park field restoration. Have a ball field right across the creek from my house that the infield and the outfield on one side of that ball field holds a lot of water. Just like they did at the Arch a number of years ago, they'll go in with a cover crop mix like that's heavy with turnips or radishes to recreate the drainage profile of that soil. Might not be a bad idea. And then highway right of ways. Again, anytime that you're putting seed down on a right of way and you're waiting for that perennial permanent cover to take effect, the cover crops are a great complement. So if you look at this photo on the left, it's a perfect example of craziness, right? It's a perfect example of what we see all the time. This is a hospital where they cannot have any slip and falls from the ice. So the snow removal contractor's best friend is his salt supplier. And you can see if the salt supplier could just come in late spring, he can probably recover a good percentage of his salt just by skinning it off the basins. The white that you see in this picture in the middle of this basin, all of this white is literally salt laying on top of the soil and pea gravel that was in that basin. When that basin was built and specified originally, it had native perennials all through that basin to provide the long-term root infiltration and the water infiltration through that stormwater basin. You see how pretty this is, this beautiful lawn. God forbid there's a clover or a dandelion in that. Well, the lawn care applicator has done a great job. He's killed all of those. And as he's worked his way across each one of these basins, walls here, he's done a great job. And guess what happens with that spray? That spray, the mist of the spray, settles out in the stormwater basin and it kills all of our native perennials. So you got this beautiful lawn until the basin doesn't function. And then you see right through here where the sod now is dead because this basin holds so much water that it takes a week or two before it clears out. This is a classic example of why or where you would try to put, or you could use, a cover crop mix to help restore that basin. This is a hospital, so every one of those parking spots is important. This drive lane is important. So how are you going to come in there with equipment and take those parking spots out while you're trying to rebuild these basins? Why wouldn't you go in with cover crops first? So here's another example. This is a project down at the Lake of the Ozarks. We did this project this past August. It was flipping dry, no water at all anywhere on the site, and no water, obviously, in the blue sky, right? So we went in after they got done with their stone work on the home. We came in and did a little finish grade across the soil in the backyard. We put down all native seed. We put down our cover crop mix. And in the backyard, because just in front of this picture is the actual lakefront. As you see over here on the right, you can see the lake. So we put down a blanket, but instead of a classic S75 blanket with plastic, we used a hemp-based blanket. So that grid is all hemp, and it does biodegrade and falls apart. This site, and you can see how green it is here, especially in the sunshine, received a 1/4 inch of rain over the first 12 weeks that it was seeded. A 1/4 inch is all, one rainfall, one event. And even with that, you can see the amount of green that's coming up through the blanket, the amount of green over here in the area that wasn't blanketed. All of that is the cover crop mix doing its job. So when we talked earlier about the cost of, or we didn't talk about cost, but talking about cost, I should say, of the cover crop mix, you're probably wondering, well, how expensive is that? Well, when we mix 1,000 pounds at a time, including the shipping from Missouri Southern Seed, who blends it for us, to St. Louis, it cost me about $1.10 per pound for that cover crop mix. At $1.10 per pound, I'm putting down 40 pounds per acre. That's under $50 for the cover crop mix. At 48 seeds per square foot, that's a lot of seed. And you're wondering, well, how does that compare? Annual rye right now is selling for $1 a pound. And if I seed at 112 pounds per acre, that's $112 versus $50. So why would we do just one cover crop? Why would we just do one? And so my challenge to all of you is if we always do what we've always done, we will always get what we've always gotten. In other words, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Or wait, why is there only one egg in one basket? And that is it for me as far as what I have prepared. So I'm happy, Lily, to answer questions the best that I can. I would give you all a couple of quick and easy resources. The on the Grow Native site, they have a new 3-ring binder on stormwater practices, which is absolutely fantastic. It's a great resource. You can actually download the soft version of that or a digital version of it. The other, if you're really into cover crops, like obviously I tend to be, the University of Missouri Extension Program has a cover crop class. It's 11 modules. It costs you a whopping $25, and you'll learn a lot about cover crops. And you might even learn a little bit about forage requirements for cattle. I think that's just one chapter, but the rest of it's pretty darn good and it's really helpful, gives you great background. And then the third reference I would give you is anything out of the Soil Health Network, especially anything from Gabe Brown that talks about sustainable or regenerative agriculture and the use of no-till and the cover crops in the no-till agriculture. Really helpful. And remember, it's learning that and applying that to what we're doing in other components of the industry that really is our challenge, and that's where we kind of get our best results. So with that, Lily, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you so much. We do have a series of questions. And I'll begin with one of the early ones when you were introducing your rise. There was a question asker that said, when you say annual rye, do you mean annual rye grass or cereal rye? Could you help clear that up?
So I'm referring to annual rye grass, which we would typically think in an agriculture component. Yeah, right, cereal rye, and cereal rye is a rock star for cover crops in the no-till ag world.
Great, thank you. We had another participant ask, when you say 60% sand, 20% each of compost and soil, were you speaking by volume there?
Yeah, typically it's by volume. So a lot of times, your soil supplier will, for example, in St. Louis, the Metropolitan Sewer District, or in St. Charles County, any of those agencies that you're doing basins for require a soil test. So the soil test comes back and it verifies a minimum of 60% or sand and then 20 and 20. They don't worry so much about the 220s. If it's 18 or 24, it's typically not too much of a deal. The big component is the 60% sand.
Great, thank you. We had a participant ask if you could restate or maybe elaborate more on where you get your seed mixes from. If you could speak on that.
So so seed mixes can be simple, right? You could go down to your favorite co-op or your favorite seed house and ask for whatever you want, right? You could go in and ask for 3 species and you could mix them yourself. I don't like to mix seed, although a concrete mixer does a great job at mixing seed. So we use Missouri Southern Seed out of Rolla as our seed house. They have all kinds of seed. They have a great website that talks a lot about cover crops, seed. If you're a big deer hunter or like to improve habitat for wildlife, they have a lot of wildlife mixes, and a lot of these cover crops, as you well know, clover and peas and turnips are all favorites of the white-tailed deer.
That was one question from a participant. If you notice that deer normally stir the mixed seed area, if especially if there are turnips in the seed mix.
Yeah, so you know, I've been on jobs where we've had deer come in and literally pull all the perennial plugs out of the ground because foolishly we planted asters instead of sedges in those basins, right? And the darn deer will pull those guys out by the roots every time. Uh, we've tried fencing, all that silliness, and the deer are going to find their way in. Period. No, there's just no question. So I would tell you with the cover crop mix, I don't really worry about it because it's temporary, right? And it's just designed to help get us over the hump and help improve the soil.
Great, thank you. We had a question on the herbicide drift, or do you know of any cover crop species that are more resistant to herbicide drift?
So, uh, if I worked for Bayer or one of those big ag companies, I think I would be trying to figure all that out. There's already some agricultural weeds like water hemp and polyamaranth, right, that are resistant to Roundup or glyphosate, but none of those are available in what we would typically use as a cover crop. Um, so they're tenacious cedars. They're really just a mess, right, to work with, and a mess to control because you can't use the classic herbicides. But the drift is a matter about education, right? It's really about methodology and technique. And I think I heard a couple of years ago that at 10 feet in the air, the mist from an ag sprayer at a 5 mile an hour wind will carry three miles away, right? So that's why in these small towns across the state where you get a big kill from 2,4-D being sprayed or Roundup being sprayed over the top of a bean or cotton or corn, and it's a windy day, that drift goes into town and it defoliates every red maple in the town. Right. And so that's the drift is really a challenge. There's ways to solve that, right? As an applicator, lower pressure, bigger droplets, right, will help manage that. The other thing is to educate the property manager to say, a little bit of dandelion or a little bit of clover, or do you want to replace that basin at $120,000?
Great, thank you. We had a question on, maybe this was just a detail that we missed, but when you put the cover crop seed out, are you just broadcasting it and then putting your landscape fabric down, or could you elaborate on that?
So, so if you remember, seed size really dictates the depth in the soil, right? And most native seeds like the top quarter to top eighth inch of seed. And most cover crops are the same way. That top quarter inch of soil is a great way. So if you've got a good seed bed, you can distribute that and cultipack it, right? And run a cultipacker over the top of the seed. Or if it's a small basin, you're probably not going to run a big machine right through the middle of it. So you could help incorporate that seed pretty easily with a leaf rake turn with the fingers up. So you're just kind of turning things over. The erosion control blankets would go right over the top of it. And then that seed will all come up through those erosion control blankets.
Great, thank you. We had a question on the terminating the cover crops, and you mentioned that some of them you terminate with herbicide, or some they just go through their life cycle. Could you elaborate on, if you terminate with herbicide, how to avoid any off-target effects of that?
Well, judicious application, right, is the key to any herbicide use, right? And I think it's what the Missouri, in case of Missouri applicators license, requires us to be our good applicators. So herbicide is just one method of termination. Uh, if if you put down native seeds on a project, let's say we're seeding on June 1st, most of them, or a good mix of those natives, aren't going to germinate until the following April. However, there's a lot of grasses, native grasses, that will germinate that within, 60 days, maybe 45 days or less. And so you get these small little plants of little blue stem or big blue stem or side oats grama or prairie dropseed, whatever it might be. A lot of the Monarda we've seen germinate without having to have that cold stratification. And so in that case, I would be hesitant to want to spray the herbicide over the top because the very thing I'm trying to create, is going to be there. Having said that, most of our natives, as we know, kind of create that little bit, that very low basal rosette of leaves, right? So you may only get 3 or 5 or 7 leaves that are only an inch or two above the soil line that first year. The old sleep, creep, and leap methodology or understanding of how that plant performs. So the winter frost is all of the species that I had on that list all terminate with a hard frost. So like this past week, a couple of days ago, it was what 12 degrees or 10 degrees in the St. Louis area. That burns up all the cover crop mix, right? It'll frost it off. It'll freeze it out. And so once that happens, then you just let it lay and it does its thing.
Great, thank you. And we had a question of, with that cover crop that's now dead on the ground, do you need to remove that in any way, or do you
Ooh,
just
let it be,
plant through? Yeah.
right? Let it be, right? It's kind of that leave the leaves thing, right? So we've worked hard. We've built the soil. A lot of those, like a turnip, right? It's collected all of that. It's created that big 3 inch, 4 inch diameter uh, uh, tuber in the ground, and then you just let it rot. And if you have somebody that's upset about the smell of turnips, well, okay, you may not want to put turnips or radishes in your mix. But to be honest with you, as that material rots and falls back into the soil, all of those nutrients are available for our goal, those native perennials that are germinating next spring.
Great, thank you. We had one question on a failed water retention basin, but is now it's all cattails. And if we wanted to reseed that successfully with natives, what do you think should be done there?
Oof. Yeah, so Typha, those cattails are a huge issue in a stormwater basin. The biggest reason why they're a problem in a stormwater basin is the Department of Natural Resources. And so remember, all these stormwater basins operate with an MS4 permit for water quality under the Clean Water Act from 1974, right? And so cattails are considered an obligate wetland species. And what I mean by that is if you have a cattail, you have a wetland, or if you have a wetland, then you have cattails. So when DNR looks at a site that has cattails in it, it's hard for them to say, oh, well, that's not a wetland because cattails are obligate wetland species. So most agencies like the Metropolitan Sewer District or municipalities in St. Charles County that I'm familiar with, for example, all require cattails to be treated and removed. And so if you're a practitioner of stewardship of basins, cattails can be like the gift that keeps on giving, right? Because they're really hard to control. So whether you go in and you cut them down or you treat them with the glove of death, right? You take a nitrile glove, you put it on, then put a jersey glove over the top of it. You soak that in a herbicide, and then you rub the stem of that typha, that cattail, with that herbicide is a great way to get it on without spraying it all over the pond. Um, the other thing to think about is to go in and cut those cigars, those seed heads off right when they begin to develop. Because as you all know, most of our native weed or our annual weed problems, if we can manage the seed, we're making big strides. Whether it's curly dock or cattails, get the seed heads off of the plant before it sets. Serratia lespedeza is another great example. That silly seed lasts for what, 85 years? And a plant can produce 10,000 or more of those seeds in a year. So it's just managing that seed load's a big step. So with the typha, with that cattail, and if you see it, you got to be aggressive. And sometimes that means a lot of education for your property manager. Sit down and say, look, here's a problem. The other thing that probably means is you're waiting. You're in hip deep and you're fighting with that stuff. It's hard to pull them out. They've got a super fibrous root system. They don't like water much over 3 foot in depth, which is kind of a good thing. But if your whole pond is full of typha, you probably don't have a deep pond anyway. It's more of a intermittent pool, maybe.
Great, thank you. We had a question regarding how these stormwater basins are to filter runoff. Do you know of any risk to birds or pollinators or things that are consuming those plants that have filtered all of these things that potentially degrade water quality? They mentioned that it's a question that comes up often in their circles.
Yeah, so I have yet to see any kind of publication. I don't know that anybody's studying it, which sounds like a great graduate student project, to understand. There are several plant species that are used a lot in bioremediation to help sequester and tie up those heavy metals in soil like copper and whatnot. That's a concern on a lot of landfills. Often you see that as an issue. So just trying to understand, I would imagine it could be translocated into the flower, but there's very few examples that I can think of those heavy metals because plants aren't using cadmium. The plants aren't using a lot of chromium, right? A lot of that heavy, crazy stuff that we tend to throw into the environment courtesy of our automobile or our truck, right? Where does the rubber go? Why do you have to buy new tires? Well, that rubber gets rubbed off every time you drive down the highway. And what does it get rubbed off in big chunks? Hopefully not. It's just little micro grading of rubber that lays on the parking lot, gets washed into the basin, and gets tied up. Now, I've heard an engineer say that's not a problem with the basin. It doesn't cause the siltation of the basin. I think all of it adds together. If you don't have a living plant in that basin isn't going to do its job, right? And so by design, the fact again, those perennial plants, those natives are putting those roots down every year, and every year some of them die. It's almost a perfect design of a perpetual motion machine, right? As long as the plants are growing, they're continuing to improve and maintain the filtration of the basin.
That's awesome. The perpetual motion machine. Thank you. A couple more questions. Thank you so much for your time.
You
People
bet.
are saying thank you all throughout the chat. So we had a question. You showed the Lake of the Ozarks site that was a residential site, but a participant asks of if this same principle of a multi-species cover crop can be translated to a smaller home construction site or urban yard. Could you speak to maybe translations from sites that could take larger plants to a site where you might want smaller plants? Are there any considerations there?
Yeah, so if you remember my slide, I said everywhere, right? And so I just be honest, my wife and I live on 3.5 acres. Every year I have a little less lawn because every year I decide I need another native area. So I'll go in and mow it short or terminate it with a herbicide. And then the first thing I do is put down a cover crop mix. That may be May, it may be August, it might be October. We run an 8 species winter mix, which I really didn't talk about, but it's real heavy in all of the winter annuals. The things that like the winter wheat, winter peas, all of those things that can tolerate the cooler temperatures or will handle the marginally cooler temperatures. But I use them. We have 2 vegetable gardens, and I'm all about a living root in the soil. So I've got an area in my lower garden that's 90 by 30 that is all cover crops. Right now, they're all dead cover crops because of the weather. But a lot of that seed is still there and it will germinate early spring. So I'll have to go in and terminate before I drill in or plant out, squash or corn or potatoes, whatever it is. And so, the undisturbed soil goes a long way to really creating that great environment. So I would tell you, I don't care if it's a 10 by 10 bed. I have 2 bags of cover crop of seed in my garage. One of them's 3 years old and it's still kicking. It's still, and I'm sure it's not 80% or 90% germination rate, but I don't care because I put it down like I'm not paying for it. And at 40 pounds per acre, which is 2.1 million seeds, I don't have time to count that many. And so what if I only have 30% germination, right? I mean, and if I get 30% in the first 30 days.
Got it. Thank you. A couple more questions. There was a participant that asked if you had any suggestions for perennial plants that can stand being underwater for a few days, and I will highlight the stormwater management book that you mentioned. It has these great plots that show the tolerance of species for their how long they can stand being in water, but I was hoping that you could just maybe call out some of your favorite perennial plants that can handle a few days of standing water.
So remember when we talk about aquatics, right? A lot of them are either submerged aquatics, so they're growing underwater, and but some of them are on the banks. So those banks are typically capable. Those bank plants are typically capable of handling a big flood event, and then ultimately that water goes away. So there are things like a lot of the sedges love wet feet and would do fantastic. I mean, sedges, if you're not familiar with sedges, you need to spend some time. Frank sedge, uh, fox sedge, I mean, there's a ton of sedges that really do well with wet feet. Um, then if you get into some of the lobelias, both of the lobelias will handle wet feet. Purple coneflower will handle wet feet. Yellow wingstem will handle wet. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that will handle wet feet. Swamp milkweed, hibiscus, the native hibiscus are fantastic. Amsonia just loves it. I mean, there's some really clever plants, and on the Grow Native plant on the web page, there's a whole breakout of plants that like wet feet. So those are the first ones that I would choose to be putting in these stormwater basins. And don't worry about not watering them. I still am confused by municipalities that require stormwater basins to be irrigated, which is nonsensical to me because it just doesn't make any sense, right? And they're probably irrigated because they're worried about the drug addicted green carpet along the sides, the lawn that goes on the sides of the basin. And I would just say, quit doing the lawn, right? Just turn that whole basin into natives and be done with it.
Thank you. That was the last question. Was a participant asked, I think maybe on the hospital planting that you showed of why do they plant grass on the edges anyway? Why not native plants there too?
Yeah, well, that's like one of the great mysteries of engineers, right? Because they've always done it that way, right? They've always done it that way, and therefore we'll always get what we've always gotten.
Thank you so much, Chuck. We'll pass it over to Amanda for some announcements, but thank you again for your time this evening.
Thank you, Lily.
All right, thank you, Chuck and Lily. Before we end today's webinar, I do have a couple of announcements about upcoming webinars that we will be seeing in 2026. So our first webinars have registration open now, and more will be released in the coming weeks. We'll begin on January 14th, 2026 at 4 p.m. with our Grow Native webinar, Let's Talk Trees, which will cover topics in native tree health, selection, and sourcing. Next, we'll have MPF's River Cane webinar, which was rescheduled from last fall. It'll now be held on January 28th at 4 p.m. Registration for both of those webinars is available now. Other topics coming this winter and spring include cultivating, conservation, and preservation in the Ozarks, finding your flock for the Missouri Bird Challenge, native fern study outcomes, a two-part soil science series, and an exploration of Ozark ethnobotany, and more. Although this concludes today's webinar, on behalf of the staff and board of MPF and the Grow Native Committee, I want to thank you, our webinar audience, for your contributions to this webinar season. Your thoughtful questions, animated comments, detailed survey feedback, and kind emails of support have helped us to produce this year's important content. With that being said, I do want to wish everybody a wonderful winter season and a happy new year. But before we go, Chuck, if there's anything that you want to announce, projects that you're working on, or events that you want to plug, I just want to turn it over to you for a moment if you want to talk about any of that.
Well, isn't that nice of you? I would just tell you that we are working on the very first Missouri Stewardship Summit, which is going to be first time to a big announce. We just had a planning meeting today. It's going to be hopefully the first week in March, probably at the Maryland Heights Community Center. It'll be geared toward elected officials, parks directors, professionals in the industry, talking about stewardship issues for municipalities, invasive species ordinances, managed native landscape ordinances, in addition to what can we do with the crazy natives or the invasives on right-of-ways. So that's coming up in March. You can check in with that. And then at Missouri Native Stewardship Services, we're going to be doing a bunch of podcasts that we're going to be filming and recording in January and February. So keep an eye there because I'm full of crap and everybody loves to hear it. So really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Chuck. It's been a delight to work with you, and we will see you and everybody else in 2026. Have a great night.
Happy New Year.
Bye.